Thank you, Angus. Kia ora koutou. Good evening. Can you hear me well? Firstly, sorry if I don't look like the one on the picture, but it's always an aspiration. Secondly, it's a great pleasure to be back in Wellington, and I never decline an invitation to come and talk to the branch, even if I'm not fully confident in what I'm going to say, because there are so many friends that I miss, and I'm very pleased to see so many of you. Excellencies, ambassadors, diplomats, great members of the Institute. Thank you for inviting me to talk today. When you talked about my previous background and my time in Wellington as a deputy ambassador of the Soviet Union, which was a long time ago, and we were communicating and talking to Gerald at the time a lot. I used to say that every New Zealander owes me a drink because I ended the Cold War in New Zealand. And I have a documented proof of that, front page of the Dominion, with me lowering the Soviet flag. Well, unfortunately, my impact has been short-term, and someone else needs to do something in the Russian embassy or the foreign ministry to restore that hope, and in terms of Russia continuing its path to democracy. So I'm going to focus on Ukraine, self-determination, territorial integrity. I understand this is a subject that has been discussed, and I'm sure many of you follow it on a daily basis and probably dig deeper into stuff than I do. I know that some of the members of the Ukrainian community are here and watching me on Zoom, so I'll be very careful in the way I formulate things and without trying to getting into too much emotion. But my presentation today is not so much about Ukraine, although of course Ukraine is the main focus, but it's all looking at some of the implications of Ukraine war in terms of where are we with this very complicated nexus of self-determination and territorial integrity. And I hope there are some lawyers in the room who will correct me if I digress a little bit from the purely legal understanding. Not that this topic hasn't been discussed or is not being discussed, but oftentimes when people talk about self-determination and territorial integrity and the impact for this part of the world, the one big issue, of course, is will China invade Taiwan? And that is our main concern in terms of implication of that tension for this part of the world. But I would like to share with you that China may not invade Taiwan, and we hope China will not invade Taiwan, but there are many other conflicts existing or emerging that are carefully watching the dynamic in Ukraine to see which way we go, which way we reconcile the two principles that ideally should be complementing each other, but oftentimes they are in tension and oftentimes called as opposites. So I will talk a little bit about this dynamic in the Ukraine context and also implications primarily for the post-Soviet area, but also beyond as well. So I'm pretty ambitious. I want to cover all these 5 things. We'll see how it goes, but I'll talk about the implications and all that. So what I'm going to say is, in part, introduction of a chapter I've written for a book that will be coming out soon by Massey University Press. I'm not commissioned by Massey University Press to do any marketing. This book is a product of the Center for Defense and Security Studies, and 2 of my colleagues, co-editors. When I offered my piece on this particular topic, they said, well, what's relevance for New Zealand? Because the book is titled State of Threat, Protecting New Zealand National Security. So my response to that and my section in the chapter is that New Zealand is involved in self-determination issues on many occasions and in many areas. And we know we have issues about co-governance here. New Zealand is part of the Declaration on Indigenous Human Rights. We have responsibilities through UN decolonization. We are part of the Piketawa Declaration, where we have to respond to challenges in the region, whether it's Solomon Islands or it's Bougainville. We can not respond to developments in Indonesia and West Papua. There's always a pressure on New Zealand to comment on these things. And of course, we are periodically asked about our perspective on Uyghurs and Xinjiang and whether we call it the genocide or not. So I believe this is something that is very important. Also, every document that we have seen, whether national security strategy, defense assessment, or navigating the shifting world, MFED, recent policy statement, they all refer to New Zealand standing firm for the rules-based international system. Well, there are many rules in the international system, and I would suggest that one of the core principles is exactly this: self-determination and territorial integrity. So if we adhere to the rules, we need to be very clear where we stand and what we do and what we and how we respond to the many challenges and issues. And finally, New Zealand is often perceived in the rest of the world as a role model in terms of our, bicultural and Waitangi Treaty kind of policies and responsibilities. And finally, Australia is going through some interesting developments with the Indigenous voice, and the opinions are split about the referendum, but it's also, we see some divisions about whether Australia should follow New Zealand in that sense or not. Now, if you look at these self-determination, territorial integrity issues, we can clearly see that, first off, for years since the Westphalian system, the focus has been on territorial integrity and sovereignty. This is how nation states come together, but increasingly human rights are starting to emerge as an important principle. And so the first thing we have is this clash and tension between territorial integrity and self-determination, state rights or human rights. And then we have conflict between the two self-determination rights, the internal and the external, because we see that in Ukraine and we see that elsewhere. And how do we harmonize all three together is kind of my theoretical part, if you want. And we'll see. So what is the dynamic in Ukraine and the Ukraine war? Well, sometimes it's the opposite, but in the case of Ukraine claims both rights, right? Ukraine's focus has been on territorial integrity, but increasingly we are also hearing from Ukraine that what they are struggling for is for self-determination in the context of anti-imperialism and not wanting to return to the Soviet fold. So there is this, connection of two. So they are not in contradiction with each other. They are part of the, Ukrainian aspiration. Now, when you look at the Russian perspective on this nexus, initially the focus was on internal self-determination, supporting people, Russians in Donbass or Crimea, which has escalated later to self-determination of the entire Ukrainian population. Why? Because Russia is liberating Ukraine from Nazism, from the Western influence. So it is elevated to the self-determination of the entire Ukraine. And not to mention, of course, certain commentary by President Putin about the artificiality of the Ukrainian statehood. And finally, now that Russia controls Crimea and Donbass and the two adjacent regions, that we are hearing more and more about Russia being prepared to protect the territorial integrity of Russia to include the 4 regions. So this escalation from looking after the Russians in Donbass and Crimea has gone up to 3. So why is it important? Because if we are looking into the end of this war and the conditions of any arrangement, besides total capitulation, one country totally surrendering, it is hard to come to some agreement or compromise if your ambitions are that high. So on the Ukrainian side, it's full self-determination, it is full territorial integrity. On the Russian side, anything you do against Russia will challenge one of the 3 things, right? Self-determination and freedom from Western influence and all. But equally, I would argue that it also possibly makes a deal easier, because if there is no full victory in the military conflict, arguably each side can refer to one of the principles they are standing by as something that they have managed to protect. And in Ukraine's case, Ukraine may not be successful in getting all of the territory back, but at least they haven't surrendered to Russia and they've kept their statehood. I'm not saying that Ukrainians are ready for that kind of deal today, but as things evolve, we'll see what happens. And for Putin, and we were expecting Putin to be challenged by his own inner circle or opposition after losing Kherson and retreating from here and there. And it looks like nothing is changing politically, his support levels. Which means that unless there are some major socioeconomic turbulences in Russia, Russia eventually can claim that they were able to defend territorial integrity somewhere, and they were able to keep Ukraine out of NATO for now and on. So moving forward, how did this all begin? I just want to go to some of the earlier stages. Every student of post-Soviet politics knows that great famous statement by President Putin that the demise of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe. But not many know that this was also said in this particular context of concern about the Russian people who found themselves beyond the fringes of Russian territory. So that reminds me of the way we take Winston Churchill's famous statement about Russia being a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, which has a second part to that statement, which is probably the key to understand Russia is to understand its national interest. So what I'm trying to say here that for Putin, the breakup of USSR was about many things, but that included his concern, genuine or not, that's something for us to debate or discuss, about the 10 or 15 million Russians who found themselves in the former Soviet republics and what happens to them. And we know that things haven't been easy, and they range from some significant challenges to Russians in places like Tajikistan, where most of the Russians have left the country during the civil wars and others, to the more benign situation in the Baltic states, where there are still also issues regarding integration of Russians in the Baltic post-Soviet societies. So just to remind you, this was former USSR. I'm not doing that for any nostalgic reasons, but maybe for Gerald, because you were ambassador to all 15 at the time, right? Thank you. Yeah. And things were not easy, but sometimes a little more predictable. I will talk a little bit also about some of the post-Soviet conflicts where I see the impact of Ukraine and the Ukraine war. So I will elaborate a little bit more, but I'm just giving you a heads up to prepare for. So, okay, so 10, 15 million Russians in former Soviet republics, and many of them are in Ukraine. And you know, Ukraine very much culturally had this certain distinctions between Western and Eastern part. Eastern part, as you can see here, mostly Russian speaking. Western side, mostly Ukrainian speaking. Also some other minorities in Ukraine, including Crimean Tatars, and the new defense minister of Ukraine, Umerov, is actually a Crimean Tatar. And there is a Hungarian population. I don't know if we have any Hungarian embassy people here, but we had a Hungarian ambassador talk to us in Auckland, and he was very tactful and polite. But we know that there are some concerns in Hungary also about what happens in Ukraine, about ethnic relations. So we had these Minsk agreements, and there was a lot of discussion and hope that the Minsk agreements would lead to some peaceful resolution. And that, of course, happened after the annexation of Crimea, which, of course, the Russian interpretation is reunification of Crimea through a referendum, which was questionable. But so what was the Minsk agreement about? It was basically about trying to reach a compromise between a special arrangement and still some element of self-governance for Donbass, and also making sure there was no infiltration or presence of Russian volunteers in Donetsk. So that was referred as this conundrum. And both sides seem to be unhappy with these agreements. And when the war started, actually, one of the reasons Putin started the war, according to him, was because the Minsk agreement were being neglected. Ukraine is not offering any self-government through the constitution, and the Ukrainians were equally unhappy because they thought that the Russians were not going to allow any kind of free expression of vote in Donbass due to their presence. So if we look back at what New Zealand said before the invasion, you can see clearly that Chris Sid, on the 17th of February, 7 days before the invasion, said that at the heart of the Russia-Ukraine confrontation are issues of sovereignty and self-determination. So I would argue that in this case, self-determination referred to that self-governance aspect of people in Donbass. And of course, New Zealand never recognized annexation of Crimea. Nanaia Mahuta's statement focused on the sovereignty and territorial integrity. So we have both there, and this is what the perspective was. So I would also suggest that this kind of conflict and dynamic has triggered a number of unrest and instability in different parts of former Soviet Union, particularly in places like Moldova, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, but also in Asia Pacific. And we know that the responses have been very different and very interesting and mixed, as I said. We have examples when members of the West Papua Liberation Front, the two speakers, can interpret the war in Ukraine very differently. One speaks in favor of Ukraine and its self-determination, and the other one, from the same organization, denounces the so-called genocide of Russians in Ukraine. So that's what I mean by examples where there have been some different interpretations and suggestions. Well, the other point I would like to make, that we know that most of the conflicts in the world today happen to be intrastate. And so this invasion in some ways has shaken us all, and how come we are back to this traditional interstate war and conflict. But at the same time, one of the surveys I found suggested that even though most of the conflicts are intrastate, increasingly we see external influence and external impact on internal conflicts. And I can say from my own experience, because I've spent also time in Sri Lanka, that the Tamil Tigers situation was very much resolved through violent action, but the self-determination issue continues. And definitely there was an involvement of, there was a China impact, and India has been traditionally also involved in this conflict. So, so we are seeing that pattern in other parts, whether it's Myanmar conflict, where we have a geopolitical interaction and elsewhere. So let me go through some of the conflicts and see what's happening and how is this message being received. As you know, one of the first conflicts in the former Soviet Union was the Transnistrian, the Pridnestrovia Republic, which was established and mostly by Russian population there, but not only Russians. There are about 500,000 people in Transnistria, which is you see that in green, the section of Moldovan, formerly republic, now an independent state, mostly separated from Russia by Ukraine. And some of the aspirations of Russian invasion, in my opinion, was actually to build different corridors and potentially even a corridor to Transnistria. Transnistrian separatism was a product also of the breakup of USSR and certain aspirations by Moldova to reunify at that time with Romania, and that triggered tension, and of course Russian heavy involvement with 1,000 or so Russian troops over there fulfilling this peacekeeping role. But interestingly, out of 500,000 people in Transnistria, there are 170,000 Russians and there are 170,000 Moldovans. So it's not just purely Russian, but it is partly Moldovan population there. Why is it so? Because like in many post-Soviet republics, we see ethnic groups which have been significantly Russified. So it is not unusual to see people in Ukraine of Russian origin or Ukrainians who are culturally more Russian than they are Ukrainian. That was the impact and implication of Russification in the former Soviet Union. So Moldova is very keen to join European Union. Moldova, at least the current government, sees an opportunity here and to break away completely from Russian dominance or influence. Recently, they expelled 45 Russian diplomats from Chisinau. That is totally unusual, but that means that Moldova is becoming more confident, and given the war in Ukraine, starting to look at opportunity here for their own self-determination. Kazakhstan is a proud independent state, but from time to time you hear some nationalists in Russia making statements similar to commentary about Ukraine not being an authentic independent state, not having a genuine state with history, and also that there are parts of Kazakhstan that actually belong to Russia. Now, you don't hear those voices too much because of preoccupation in Ukraine, but in case, and if, and depends if Russia is successful in Ukraine, potentially Kazakhstan could be a target of new tension based on this ethnic divisions. The Baltic states have a significant Russian population. You know, there's concern in the Baltic states about the Ukraine war. There's significant concern about the Wagner group, and you say, so what? There's like 1,000, 2,000 private security. Why are we worried about? And why should the Baltic states be worried about anything? Because they are members of NATO. They're, protected by Article 5. And I think the issue here is that the reason I think they are worried is they don't expect a Russian invasion the way it happened in Ukraine, but some sort of a hybrid war using Russian presence of Russians in the Baltic states to inject some trouble and violence and tension is not ruled out. Now, like in most countries, Russian communities are divided between those who, I would say, maybe minority. I don't have any evidence or statistic about Russian community in New Zealand, but from my observations, most people don't want to get involved. Some people openly protest, and there's a smaller group that believes that Russia is doing the right thing. But it's very different in the Baltic states with that kind of population, because what the war does, it actually inflates more of anti-Russian sentiments in the Baltic states. And that is very dangerous, in my opinion, because it looked like the 90s tension was starting to evaporate as the Baltic states were trying to integrate Russian population in their societies. And now with this increased suspicion about Russians, about restrictions on any Russian tourism or Russian presence, that unfortunately raises the temperature. I don't know whether you're aware of this Suwalki corridor, which is 60-kilometer kind of territory between Lithuania and Poland. Kaliningrad is an enclave of Russia. When Soviets took over Königsberg and created the Kaliningrad region, very few expected the Soviet Union to break up. So there was no problem in not having a direct border between Kaliningrad and the Russian Federation. But the breakup created these situations, and we know there's many issues and problems in terms of transiting and connectivity. And this is potentially an area where we may see, if anything Wagner Group can do or will do, is most likely to create this tension around this corridor. And this is why Poland is very vigilant, and Poland has responded strongly in terms of protecting this corridor. Let's now move to Central Asia, which seems to be stable under primarily authoritarian regimes, but there are some ethnic issues boiling over there as well. See, there are Russia and China. I think there are the two, in my opinion, most prominent countries where administrative arrangements have very much heavily depended on ethnicity and ethnic autonomy. And that was a great idea of communists and Bolsheviks, that this was the way to bring ethnic people together under one umbrella. And that seemed to be a success for some time, but now it's becoming and has been a time bomb, and we know what happened to the Soviet Union. And similarly, in China, we have these autonomous regions that are problematic. So Tajikistan has Gorno-Badakhshan autonomous region, which is populated mostly by Amiris who follow follow the Ismaili kind of strand of Islam, about 200,000 of them, and there have been tensions and some protestations by Amiris that they are one of the kind of underdeveloped regions. Many of them don't speak Tajik language. I don't know how many of you are aware of Fergana Valley, which is a voting mix of, you look at the map here, you see you have these enclaves of Kyrgyz, Tajik, and Uzbek population all in this Fergana Valley, and we have had major issues and fights and conflicts in that part, and that continues to be an issue as there is still very significant tension between Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, in particular about some sharing of water resources and so on. Uzbekistan was one of the few countries, republics of Soviet Union, who actually kept that constitutional right of one of their autonomous regions to secede. And Karakalpakstan is a region with 2 million people, Karakalpaks, who have a veto power on any developments in their region. And there have been also some, especially in 2022, when Uzbekistan government decided to remove that clause from the constitution about the right to secede. There were major protests, and I think that vote didn't go ahead. Now, which is where I was born, the Armenian part of the South Caucasus, and you know we have major issues here, and I promised to Rod to talk a little bit about Nagorno-Karabakh as well. So, so we saw some regions in the former Soviet Union which have a very strong self-determination situations there that could explode, and they are very carefully watching the situation in Ukraine. But we also have cases, and I'll start with South Caucasus, where we are also seeing more and more pressure on stabilization through restoring territorial integrity. One case is Azerbaijan, a country that was victorious in the war with Armenia in 2020. Azerbaijan was able to push back the Armenians from most of the areas that they occupied in Nagorno-Karabakh and around Nagorno-Karabakh. And there are some peace arrangements about that, but what is happening is that, and this is also based on my kind of direct conversations with the Armenian ambassador, who first Armenian ambassador pointed to New Zealand, that the Armenians see no hope in actually seeing Nagorno-Karabakh independent or even merging with Armenia in any way. So all they are advocating for right now to protect the human rights of the 120,000 Armenian minorities sitting in Nagorno-Karabakh. And if you know the recent developments, the Lachin corridor between Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia right now has been basically blocked. There are some humanitarian issues there, but importantly, of course, two countries have a major role in the way this will evolve. Russia is one and Turkey is another one. So again, talking about influence from outside. Russians have peacekeeping role, but because of their preoccupation in Ukraine, we're seeing that Russian peacekeepers are not really coping well with their role. Turkey has traditionally supported Azerbaijan and Azerbaijan's right for its territorial integrity. But it is also my expectation, and I'm seeing some progress in Armenia-Turkey relations, that I think it will be, and I know we have some very important senior Turkish representatives here. I think we have an opportunity for Turkey also to step up and make sure that once there is no challenge to territorial integrity of Azerbaijan, the human rights aspect should be elevated. And that could be an opportunity for Turkey to show that Turkey has no bias and is ready to move on and stabilize situation, because the war in Armenia, Azerbaijan doesn't serve, in my opinion, the interests of Turkey or Russia. The other one is Georgia. Georgia lost South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And we are hearing stronger voices in Georgia that this is the time, this is the trend for territorial integrity. Everyone wants Ukraine to restore territorial integrity. We lost our territories. You hear talk about Ukraine and Georgia seeing eye to eye on some of these things. Again, in my opinion, humble opinion, it is not that easy. Abkhazia and South Ossetia separated from Georgia, not just because the Russians wanted them to separate, but there were some genuine ethnic tensions. And if you remember the start of the breakup of USSR, many republics, including Georgia, went through some, there was a rise of national sentiment, which is understandable after years of communist suppression of any ethnic nationalist aspiration. That was understandable. But that also created this fear and concerns about minorities. Mr. Gamsahurdia, who was the president at the time, basically revoked the autonomous status of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So that was one of the triggers for that. So now what I'm saying is talking about restoring territorial integrity is not a simple act, and we have to be careful there. And finally, Russian Federation. Some commentary from Ukraine and elsewhere is that the best outcome of the war, the positive outcome, would be to see Russia fall apart. And are there signs of Russia falling apart? Well, not really, but there are some growing concerns, particularly that most of the recruits in the Russian army come from ethnic regions. And that is creating very few Muscovites and St. Petersburg people are recruited. So they are not less developed and so on. And also, this is seen by Russian opposition, people like Kasparov or Khodorkovsky, as an opportunity, because the systemic opposition in Russia is there. There is no political opposition. And if you go back to Soviet Union, Mr. Boris Yeltsin, with the Ukrainian, Russian, and Belarusian leaders, signed the so-called Belovesh-Pusha agreement. And they used independence of the Russian and Ukrainian and Belarusian and other republics also as a political tool, because there was no multi-party system. So self-determination was an important tool in some political change. So there is some similarity between what the Russian opposition wants to happen in Russia and what happened in the Soviet Union. But the commonalities end there because there are many differences. The differences are that in the Soviet Union, Russians constituted 50% of the population. In the Russian Federation, they are 80%. And don't be fooled by this map of colors of autonomous regions, 20 or so ethnic regions in Russian Federation, because in the majority of those, the predominant ethnic group are Russians. Not to mention that many smaller minority groups are quite Russified. Secondly, whether that's important or relevant at all to talk about legality in the Russian Federation, but Soviet constitution had the right for republics to secede. The Russian Federation constitution doesn't allow that. And finally, there is a geopolitical issue here. People like Henry Kissinger are warning about not anyway, pushing any, activities to undermine Russian Federation, or because it could spark major fragmentation, who will end up with nuclear weapons. And if you go back to Soviet Union, I would suggest to you that I think the West wasn't really keen to support Boris Yeltsin in this kind of self-determination aspiration. There was still, I think, preference to keep the Soviet Union together, democratic, but together, not to see this total fragmentation. And of course, there's always China. That completely destroyed Russian Federation makes China much more influential in that part. So whether my personal point is that I see no sign of any breakup, but tensions could happen here and there, particularly in North Caucasus. We have a very dictatorial regime in Chechnya, but that may not last forever. We have a situation in Dagestan and elsewhere. So, and finally, I want to bring us back to our own perspectives and importance of rules and power in some of our statements. And I bring this reference to New Zealand as a country of contracts to see your reaction. And I've been asking my own students and colleagues whether they see a country of contracts reference as a strength or a weakness in terms of the way we can influence and shape the rules-based international system. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
So we've got time for about 20 minutes of questions. If you are on Zoom, if you can add a question to the chat and Hamish will relay that. Who's first?
Thank you, Julian Ludbrook. Thank you very much. It's interesting to hear about the spread of nationalities within what used to be the Soviet Union. The issue of the rights of minorities within sovereign states has been an uncertain area. After the Second World, the emphasis was very much on preserving the territorial integrity of states and not having a repeat of what happened leading into the Second World War. So your comments are sort of interesting in that historical context, and I guess it is an evolving issue. But what I'm interested in hearing from you is a little bit more of an elaboration about the Minsk Accords and why they failed. Was it a failure by the Ukraine to try and provide greater autonomy? Was it the actions of the Russians in actually preventing efforts of that kind genuinely to foster an outcome that preserved Donbass within the Ukraine? And the Russian populations within those areas, do they have a genuine sentiment in one direction or another, or is it simply impossible to tell?
Thank you. The Minsk agreements were very much signed after the Crimean episode, right? The annexation of Crimea. And while there was no blood spilled during that annexation, mostly, there's no resistance from Ukraine. That led to complete collapse of any trust between the two. So you can have all sorts of agreements on paper. And Minsk agreement was about that. The Minsk, and if you hear what some people say, including former Chancellor Merkel and others, that Minsk agreement was seen as maybe an opportunity to calm down these tensions and maybe launch some process to reconciliation. But that happened in the situation of total lack of trust and some other elements to that. Russia wanted Ukraine to make a constitutional change and basically establish a federal system in Ukraine. That's not easy because, well, unlike Russia, Ukraine has a multi-party system. And there were issues and tensions about doing that. There were some parties who were for, others who were against. And if you remember, President Zelensky, when he became president, his promise was not to fight a war with Russia, but find some ways of a compromise and dialogue. So democracy in Ukraine was part of the situation where there wasn't possible to reach a consensus on that, I think. And there was a complete lack